secret. One truth no one talks about. Stay with me, and like, subscribe, and share if you want more.
Everyone in our small Nebraska town knew me as the guy who inherited the family cattle farm after Dad passed in 2018. 60 acres wasn't much compared to the big operations, but it kept me busy enough, especially during calving season when I needed extra hands. I just turned 31 that spring, still learning the ropes of running the whole operation solo, juggling the books and the actual farming, when I put out word at the feed store that I needed temporary help. Most locals already had their own work, so I wasn't surprised when the only person who showed up was someone nobody recognized, a man who said he'd been working farms down in Kansas and was heading north for the summer. His name was Carl Brennan, and right away I noticed how he barely made eye contact when we talked. Not in a shifty way, more like he was just deeply uncomfortable with people, which honestly wasn't that unusual for farm hands passing through. He had rough, calloused hands that told me he knew work, and when I showed him around the property that first day in early May, he seemed most interested in the back 40 acres where we had a large pond surrounded by thick woods. The cattle rarely went back there since we had water tanks closer to the barn, so I mentioned it was pretty much just wildlife habitat, maybe needed some fence maintenance along the tree line. Carl just nodded, said he could handle whatever needed doing, and asked if he could park his old camper van near the equipment shed. For the first couple weeks, Carl was exactly what I needed. He showed up before sunrise, worked steady through the heat of the day, and never complained about anything I asked him to do. He fixed fences faster than any hired help I'd had before, had a good sense for handling the cattle without spooking them, and even repaired some equipment I'd been meaning to get to for months. But I started noticing he spent every lunch break walking back toward that pond area, always carrying a small backpack, always alone. When I asked if he was fishing back there, he just shrugged and said he liked the quiet, needed to clear his head away from the noise of the farm equipment. By the third week, I began seeing things that made me uneasy, though I kept telling myself I was being paranoid about a good worker. Carl would come back from his lunch breaks with fresh scratches on his arms, and sometimes his face, deep ones that looked like they'd come from thorns or branches. When I mentioned he should be careful in those woods, maybe wear longer sleeves, he got this strange look and said he knew what he was doing, that he'd been dealing with wild areas his whole life. He started getting territorial about that section of the property too, always volunteering to check the fence lines back there before I even asked, always insisting he could handle any maintenance around the pond by himself. One afternoon in late May, my neighbor Tom stopped by to return a tool he'd borrowed, and we got to talking by the barn. Carl was working on a tractor nearby, but when Tom mentioned how his daughter and her friend had gone missing from a town about 40 miles south last month, I saw Carl's whole body go rigid. He dropped the wrench he was holding, and when it clanged on the concrete, he flinched like someone had fired a gun. Tom didn't notice, kept talking about how the girl's car was found abandoned on a rural road. No sign of them anywhere. But I watched Carl gather his tools and walk quickly toward his van without saying a word. That night, I heard his van engine start around midnight, saw the headlights sweep across my bedroom window as he drove off, but the next morning he was back working like nothing had happened. I started paying closer attention after that, maybe checking on him more than I should have. Found out he always paid for everything in cash at the feed store, never used the local diner where most farm workers grabbed breakfast, and nobody had seen him anywhere in town except for buying supplies. When I casually asked where in Kansas he'd worked before, he got defensive, said it was a small operation near the Oklahoma border, nobody I'd know, and changed the subject immediately. He'd been with me about a month when I decided to walk back to the pond myself one evening after he'd left, just to see what he was doing back there during all those lunch breaks. The path through the woods was more worn than I remembered, like someone had been walking it daily for weeks, which made sense given Carl's routine. But when I got closer to the pond, I noticed other things that didn't make sense at all. There were areas where the underbrush had been cleared away, not in a random pattern, but in specific spots around the water's edge. Fresh tool marks on some trees, like someone had been digging and needed to lean a shovel against them. The ground in 3 or 4 places looked different, recently disturbed but already starting to grow back with spring grass. I told myself he'd probably been burying trash or maybe dealing with some dead animals he'd found. But something about the size and shape of those patches made my chest tighten. The next morning, Carl could tell something was different. He kept watching me while he worked, and when lunchtime came, he didn't head back to the pond like usual. Instead, he sat in his van, windows down, just staring toward the woods like he was guarding them. I tried to act normal, talked about the weather and upcoming cattle auction, but there was this tension between us now, thick as the humid air before a storm. That Friday, he told me his mother was sick down in Arkansas, said he needed to leave for the weekend but would be back Monday morning. He seemed nervous when he said it, kept rubbing his hands on his jeans, and I noticed dirt under his fingernails, the kind that gets deep under there when you've been digging without gloves. Saturday morning his van was gone like he'd said it would be, but something kept gnawing at me about those disturbed patches by the pond. I tried to focus on my usual weekend work, but by noon I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed a spade from the tool shed and walked back there, my heart hammering harder with each step through those woods. The first patch I tried was near a big oak tree, and about 2 feet down, my spade hit something that wasn't root or rock. I cleared more dirt away with my hands, and that's when I saw it. A piece of fabric looked like part of a jacket, pink or maybe coral-colored. My mouth went completely dry and I stood there for maybe 5 minutes just staring at that scrap of material before I walked back to the house and called the sheriff. They brought in a whole team that afternoon, deputies and state police and people with equipment I'd never seen before. By Sunday evening, they'd found 2 bodies, both young women, both in shallow graves near the pond's edge. One had been there maybe 6 weeks, the other probably 3, according to what I overheard the investigators saying. The pink fabric I'd found belonged to a University of Iowa student who disappeared from a rest stop 50 miles away. The other woman was a waitress from a truck stop near the Missouri border, last seen walking to her car after a night shift. Both of them had been reported missing. Their pictures in newspapers I'd never thought to connect to my quiet farmhand who kept to himself and worked hard. Carl never came back Monday morning, never came back at all. They found his van abandoned at a rest area in South Dakota 3 days later, wiped clean of prints but with blood evidence in the back that matched both victims. Turns out Carl Brennan wasn't even his real name. He was actually Robert Hutchinson, wanted for questioning in similar disappearances across 4 states over the past 2 years. The FBI agent who interviewed me said he'd probably been using farms like mine all along, places with woods and water, isolated enough that nobody would notice fresh digging, owners too busy with daily work to pay attention to remote corners of their property. They figured he kept moving whenever he sensed someone getting suspicious, just drifting from one farm job to another, state to state, leaving bodies buried in places that might never be found if not for dumb luck or an observant owner. They never caught him, far as I know. Sometimes I check online, looking for news about Robert Hutchinson or similar cases, but there's nothing. The FBI said he probably changed his appearance, got new fake documents, might even be working another farm somewhere right now. I had to drain that pond later that year, couldn't stand looking at it, and I sold the back 40 acres to my neighbor Tom, who turned it into pasture. But even now, 5 years later, whenever someone comes looking for farm work, especially if they're traveling through and seem eager to work alone, I tell them I'm fully staffed. I learned the hard way that sometimes the real monsters are just quiet men with dirt under their fingernails, and the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly where to hide their kills. Moving into Grandma Rose's farmhouse felt like stepping into a time capsule from 1973, complete with harvest gold appliances and that peculiar smell of old wood mixed with decades of Sunday dinners. I just turned 31 that March, and after the reading of her will, I suddenly owned 40 acres of Indiana farmland with a 2-story house that hadn't seen a proper update since disco was king. My sister wanted nothing to do with it, said the isolation would drive her crazy, But after years of cramped city apartments and neighbors who practiced drums at midnight, the solitude seemed like exactly what I needed. The nearest neighbor lived about 3 miles down the gravel road, and honestly, that suited me just fine. I spent the first 2 weeks hauling donation boxes, scrubbing floors, and discovering all the quirks of a house that had settled into its bones over 50 years. Everything changed on my third Thursday there, when I heard the first knock while washing dishes after dinner. Just a soft tap 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 on the back porch door, barely audible over the running water. I dried my hands and went to check, but the motion sensor light showed nothing except the empty wooden deck and the field stretching out toward the old barn about 200 feet away. Figured it was just a branch or maybe a raccoon investigating the new human in residence. But then it happened again the next night, this time at the kitchen window while I was making tea. Same rhythm, same gentle persistence, except windows don't get knocked on by falling branches. I pulled back the curtain fast, trying to catch whatever it was, but again saw only darkness and my own reflection staring back. By the fourth night, when the knocking moved to the cellar door inside the mudroom, I'd stopped trying to explain it away as wildlife. Saturday morning brought the first real sign that something was seriously wrong. I came downstairs to make coffee and noticed the basement door handle was covered in dried mud, thick globs of it caked into the grooves like someone had grabbed it repeatedly with filthy hands. The door was still locked, thank God, but seeing that dirt made my chest tighten in a way those knocks hadn't. I grabbed paper towels and cleaned it off, telling myself maybe I'd done it myself while gardening and forgotten, even though I hadn't been near the basement in days. The handle was old brass, worn smooth by decades of use, and the mud had dried into every tiny scratch and dent. What really got me was how the dirt pattern showed multiple grip attempts, overlapping prints like someone had stood there for a while, trying again and again. I spent that whole day checking every lock twice, moving through the house with this nervous energy I couldn't shake. The farmhouse had too many entrance points, I realized, counting them like a paranoid inventory. Front door, back porch door, mudroom side entrance, cellar door from inside, plus the external bulkhead doors that led straight to the basement from outside, though those had been padlocked shut since I arrived. 9 windows on the ground floor alone, most with those old-style latches that barely held. The barn had its own problems. A side door that wouldn't close properly, and windows so old the glass had that wavy quality that distorted everything you saw through them. As darkness fell that Saturday, I found myself pulling all the curtains closed, something I'd never done before, preferring to wake with natural light. But natural light seemed less important than not feeling like I was living in a fishbowl. That night, around 2 a.m, the gravel driveway woke me up. You learn the sounds of a place pretty quick when you're alone, and that crunching rhythm of footsteps on loose stones was unmistakable. Not an animal. Animals don't walk with that steady, deliberate pace. I crept to my bedroom window and peered through a gap in the curtains, heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The moon was bright enough to see the driveway clearly, and there was someone down there, just a dark shape moving between the house and the barn. They weren't hurrying, weren't trying to hide, just walking back and forth like they were measuring something or checking distances. The figure stopped near the barn side entrance, stood there for maybe 30 seconds, then walked toward the house, disappearing from my line of sight as they moved under the window. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but the battery was at 12% because I'd forgotten to charge it, and of course Grandma Rose never had a landline installed. The nearest police station was in town, 25 minutes away on a good day. I stood there in my pajamas, listening to those footsteps circle the house, stopping at what sounded like each door, each window. They were testing things, I realized with this sick feeling spreading through my gut. Learning which boards creaked, which gravel patches were loudest, mapping out the property like they were planning something. After what felt like hours but was probably 10 minutes, the footsteps moved back toward the barn. Then came the sound that made me grab the baseball bat from under my bed, the sharp crack of breaking glass, clear and deliberate, from the barn side window. Not an accident, not thrown rock, but something purposeful that sent shards tinkling onto the ground. The house went silent except for my own breathing, but I knew they hadn't left. They were in the barn now, doing God knows what, and I was trapped between calling 911 with my dying phone or saving the battery in case things got worse. I chose to wait, clutching that bat like it could actually protect me from someone bold enough to break into property while I was clearly home. Through the thin farmhouse walls, I heard them exit the barn and start their methodical check of the house's entrances. First the front door, a slow turn of the handle, testing. Then footsteps on the wraparound porch, boards groaning under their weight. The back door handle jiggled next, longer this time, more insistent. They knew exactly which doors I'd checked earlier, which ones might have been forgotten. The mudroom door got the same treatment, then silence for a moment before I heard them at the bulkhead doors, the metallic rattle of the padlock being tugged. My phone showed 9% battery when I finally dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher about the intruder. She kept asking me to speak up, but I could hear them moving along the house's foundation, probably checking the ground floor windows now. The dispatcher said a unit was on the way, but we both knew what 25 minutes meant out here. She stayed on the line, my phone dropping to 6%, then 5%, her voice cutting in and out as the connection struggled. Then I heard what I'd been dreading, the subtle scrape of a window being pushed up. Not forced, not broken, just sliding open like they knew exactly which one had a broken latch. The dispatcher was saying something about locking myself in the bathroom, but my phone screen went black, battery dead. I heard feet hit the floor downstairs, careful but not silent, and the sound of someone moving through my grandmother's kitchen like they'd been there before. The old farmhouse betrayed every movement with creaks and groans, so I knew they were heading for the stairs. I had maybe 30 seconds to decide, hide, run, or fight. The bat in my hands felt like a toy against someone this prepared, someone who'd spent nights learning my routine, watching me pull those curtains closed. I crept to my bedroom door and turned the lock, this pathetic little button lock that wouldn't stop anyone determined. Through the heating vent, I could hear them downstairs, opening drawers in the kitchen, not ransacking but searching for something specific. Then their footsteps moved to the living room, paused at what must have been the family photos on the mantel, and headed for the staircase. The first step groaned under their weight, then the second, each sound getting closer while I stood there trying to think of literally any option that didn't end badly. I made my choice when they reached the landing. Grabbed my car keys from the dresser, slipped out of my bedroom as quietly as I could manage, and headed for the back stairs that led straight to the mudroom. These stairs were narrower, servant stairs from when the house was built, and I knew them better than the intruder could. My bare feet made almost no sound on the old wood, though my breathing seemed impossibly loud in the darkness. I reached the mudroom just as I heard them trying my bedroom door upstairs, the handle turning once, twice, then a sharp shoulder slam against the wood. The mudroom door was locked from earlier, but I had the key on my ring. My fingers fumbled with it while crashes came from upstairs, the sound of my bedroom door finally giving way. Got the door open and ran for my car, gravel cutting into my feet, not caring about the pain, just needing to reach the driver's door before they realized I'd escaped. The engine turned over on the first try, thank God, and I reversed hard down the driveway, not bothering with headlights until I hit the main road. In the rearview mirror, I saw a flashlight beam sweep across the mudroom door, then disappear. I drove straight to the police station in town, walked in barefoot and probably looking insane, and told them everything. 2 officers followed me back, but by then the house was empty. Just my broken bedroom door and muddy footprints through the kitchen as proof I wasn't imagining things. They found where someone had been camping in the barn's loft, maybe for weeks, with a sleeping bag, empty food cans, and a notebook filled with observations about the house, my routine, which lights I turned on at what times. The officer showed me one page that made me pack up and leave that same day. A detailed drawing of the house's floor plan, every door and window marked, with notes about which ones were usually locked and which weren't, dated starting 3 days before I'd even moved in. Never did find out who it was, though the police suspected someone who'd been watching the obituaries. knowing the house would be empty after Grandma Rose died. They probably didn't expect anyone to move in so quickly, had already settled into the barn when I arrived, then decided to wait me out or scare me off rather than find somewhere else. I sold the farmhouse 6 months later to a developer who turned it into 3 rental properties, and I made sure to do the closing remotely. Sometimes I still dream about those footsteps on gravel, that methodical testing of doors, the sound of someone moving through a house like they belonged there more than I did. But mostly I'm just grateful for my tiny apartment with its chain lock, deadbolt, and neighbors close enough to hear me scream. Sometimes life throws you into situations that change everything you thought you knew about reading people. During the summer of 2022, I was barely keeping my head above water financially, juggling 2 part-time jobs at a warehouse and a gas station just to make rent on my studio apartment outside Minneapolis. My cousin Kevin mentioned his neighbor needed someone to watch over a farm while recovering from hip surgery, and the pay was decent enough that I could quit both jobs and still come out ahead. Meeting Harold Garrison that first time, he struck me as your typical Minnesota farmer. Weathered hands, soft-spoken, the kind of guy who probably had coffee with the same group of buddies every morning for the past 40 years. His property stretched about 60 acres of corn and soybeans, with a modest farmhouse, 2 barns, and a chicken coop that had seen better days. The arrangement seemed perfect for someone like me who needed steady work and didn't mind the isolation. Harold walked me through everything despite moving slowly with his walker, pointing out where he kept the feed for the chickens and goats, showing me the irrigation controls, explaining which gates needed checking every evening. He had this gentle way of talking, never raising his voice even when the rooster tried attacking my legs during the tour. The daily routine he laid out was straightforward: morning feeding, checking water lines, making sure equipment stayed locked in the main barn, and doing a perimeter check before dark. He handed me a flip phone for emergencies and told me to call if anything seemed unusual, though he assured me nothing ever happened out there except the occasional deer getting into the corn. I moved into the small guest room above the garage that same week, grateful for the chance to save money and work somewhere peaceful for once. For 3 months, everything ran like clockwork. Harold had his surgery in early September and went to stay with his daughter in Wisconsin for recovery, leaving me to handle the farm solo. The work became meditative in a way I hadn't expected, waking up at sunrise to feed the animals, walking the irrigation lines while morning mist hung over the fields, spending evenings repairing fence posts or organizing tools in the barn. Neighbors would wave when driving past, but mostly kept to themselves, and the only regular visitor was a feed delivery guy named Dale, who came every 2 weeks and always had some local gossip to share. Harold called every Sunday to check in, his voice getting stronger each week, asking about the animals and reminding me to oil the tractor even though I'd already done it twice. I started feeling genuinely proud of keeping everything running smoothly, even managed to fix the automatic water system for the goats when it broke, without having to call anyone for help. That Tuesday in November started like any other, until I noticed the black SUVs parked at the end of the driveway around 10 in the morning. 4 vehicles total, all with tinted windows, and I could see people in dark clothing standing near them talking into radios. My first thought was maybe Harold had passed away, and his family sent lawyers or something, but when they started walking up the driveway in formation, I knew this was something else entirely. The woman in front held up a badge before I could even ask what was happening. FBI, she said, and they had a warrant to search the property as part of an ongoing investigation. My mouth went completely dry as she handed me the paperwork, which had Harold's name and address but was filled with legal language I couldn't process in the moment. They told me to stay by the house while they conducted their search, and one agent remained with me, politely declining to answer any of my questions about what they were looking for or why they were there. I watched from the kitchen window as teams spread across the property with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar equipment, focusing most of their attention on the northwest corner, where Harold kept an old equipment shed I'd never needed to enter. The agent staying with me, a younger guy who introduced himself as Agent Nowak, seemed sympathetic to my confusion, and eventually mentioned they were investigating connections to interstate drug trafficking from several years back. He asked how long I'd been working there, if Harold had any regular visitors, whether I'd noticed anything unusual about the property or found anything strange while doing maintenance. All I could tell him was what I knew. Harold seemed like a quiet old farmer who mostly talked about corn prices and his bad hip, and the only things I'd found were rusty tools and mice nests in the barns. By noon, they'd set up a tent near the old shed and brought in excavation equipment, which made my chest tighten, in a way I couldn't quite explain. The digging went on for hours, methodical and precise, while I tried to go about normal tasks to keep myself from staring at them constantly. Around 4 in the afternoon, Agent Nowak's radio crackled and his whole demeanor shifted as he listened to whatever was being said. He told me to stay put and jogged over to where the others had gathered around a hole they'd dug about 6 feet deep. I could see them photographing something, placing evidence markers and making phone calls with serious expressions that made my stomach churn. After what felt like forever, the lead agent came back and informed me they'd discovered a buried 55-gallon drum containing what appeared to be firearms, packaging materials consistent with drug trafficking, and personal effects that might belong to a missing person from 2016. She said they'd need me to come to their field office the next day to give a formal statement, and that I should find somewhere else to stay for a few days while they processed the scene. That night at Kevin's house, I couldn't stop scrolling through news articles on my phone, searching Harold's name along with terms like drug trafficking and organized crime. What I found made me feel like I'd been living in some kind of alternate reality for the past 3 months. Harold Garrison wasn't just some retired farmer. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, he'd been connected to a major trafficking network that moved methamphetamines through the rural Midwest, using farms and agricultural businesses as cover for distribution. The articles mentioned he'd testified in a federal case in 2008 that sent several people to prison, including a man named Vincent Russo, who was believed to control much of the drug trade across 3 states. There were grainy newspaper photos of a younger Harold in a suit outside a courthouse, looking nothing like the gentle old man who'd shown me how to check if eggs were fertilized. The missing person the agents mentioned turned out to be Anthony Cullen, one of Russo's former associates who'd disappeared right after Harold's testimony, and who many believed had been planning to retaliate against witnesses. The next morning at the FBI field office, I spent 4 hours going through every detail of my time at the farm, with 2 agents who recorded everything and had me sign multiple statements. They showed me photos of people, asking if I'd seen any of them around the property, pictures of vehicles they wanted to know if I recognized, even screenshots of social media profiles to see if Harold had mentioned any of these names. One photo stopped me cold. A man with distinctive scarring on his neck who I remembered seeing at a gas station near the farm about a month earlier. Someone who'd made small talk about the weather, but seemed to be watching me more than was normal. The agents exchanged looks when I mentioned this, making notes and asking for every detail I could remember about the encounter. They explained that several of Russo's old crew had been released from prison in recent years, and were persons of interest in ongoing investigations, though they couldn't tell me if I was in any danger, or if Harold had known about the barrel buried on his property. What really got to me was when they pulled up a map showing all the properties Harold had owned or managed over the years. 12 different farms spread across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Most sold off in the early 2000s, right before his testimony. The agents theorized that these properties might have been used as waypoints in the trafficking network, places to store product or money temporarily while moving it across state lines. They asked if Harold had ever mentioned other properties, if he'd given me keys or access codes to anywhere else, if there were areas of the farm he'd specifically told me to avoid. The truth was, he'd been nothing but straightforward about everything, even gave me a detailed map he'd drawn by hand of all the irrigation lines and gates. But now I wondered about that shed in the northwest corner, how he'd casually mentioned it was just full of old equipment from his father's time and not worth messing with, how the lock on it was newer than any other lock on the property. I tried calling Harold after leaving the FBI office, but his phone went straight to voicemail, and his daughter Gloria called me an hour later, sounding shaken and angry. She said federal agents had shown up at her house that morning with questions, that Harold had suffered what they were calling a stress-induced cardiac episode and was in the hospital, that their family lawyer had advised them not to speak with anyone about the situation. She wanted to know what I'd told them, if I'd known anything about her father's past, why I hadn't warned them something like this might happen. I tried explaining that I was just as blindsided as anyone, that her father had only ever been kind to me, but she hung up before I could finish. The next few days were a blur of news vans showing up at Kevin's house. Once word got out about my connection to the farm, reporters calling my phone until I had to turn it off, and the surreal experience of seeing Harold's farm on the evening news with yellow tape around the excavation site. A week later, Agent Nowak called with an update that made everything click into place in the worst possible way. The forensics team had determined that the barrel had been buried sometime in late 2016, several months after Harold's testimony had concluded, and Anthony Cullen had disappeared. The personal items inside, a wallet, a class ring from a Wyoming high school, a distinctive watch, had been confirmed as belonging to Cullen through DNA evidence from his family. The weapons matched those used in several unsolved crimes across state lines, and the packaging materials had residue from methamphetamines, matching the chemical signature of Russo's old operation. Most disturbing was that soil analysis showed the barrel had been moved at least once before being buried at Harold's farm, suggesting someone had deliberately placed it there either to frame Harold or hide evidence where they thought no one would look. Harold himself was still in the hospital, and through his lawyer maintained he had no knowledge of the barrel, but the investigation had expanded to include several other former witnesses from the 2008 trial who might have been similarly targeted. The FBI cleared me of any involvement after 2 more weeks of investigation, but the damage to my life was already done. Every job application I submitted seemed to dead end once employers Googled my name and found articles about the farmhand who uncovered mob burial site or caretaker's shocking discovery on Minnesota farm. Harold passed away in his sleep 3 weeks after that initial raid, never having left the hospital, never able to explain his side of the story or whether he'd suspected something might be hidden on his property. Gloria sent me a brief text saying the farm would be sold to cover legal fees and that my final paycheck would be mailed. I ended up moving to stay with my sister in Colorado, starting over with a warehouse job where nobody knew about my connection to the case. Sometimes I think about that morning feeding the chickens, having no idea that federal agents were already positioned at the end of the driveway, that I was standing above evidence of a murder while scattering corn feed, that Harold might have hired me specifically to have an innocent witness on the property in case this day ever came. The not knowing is what keeps me up at night, whether I was just incredibly unlucky or whether Harold chose me precisely because I was naive enough to never question the gentle old farmer with the bad hip who just needed someone to tend his animals. People say isolation changes you, and after inheriting my uncle's farm out in northern Montana, I was starting to understand what they meant. It was early October when I first noticed something wasn't right, about 6 months after I'd moved out there to escape the mess of my life in Phoenix. The property stretched for nearly 200 acres, mostly wheat fields and pasture land, with the nearest neighbor being old Frank Gibbs, who lived 8 miles down the gravel road. I'd been fixing up the place slowly, learning to work the land, finding peace in the endless quiet that wrapped around the farmhouse like a heavy blanket. My German shepherd Duke had taken to the country life better than I had, spending his days chasing rabbits and barking at the occasional deer that wandered too close to the vegetable garden I was trying to keep alive. That particular Monday started like any other, with me heading out to the barn around dawn to check on the equipment I'd been restoring. Duke was already outside, sniffing around the chicken coop when I noticed his hackles rise, his nose pressed against the dirt near the barn's side entrance. Fresh boot prints marked the damp ground, definitely not mine since I always wore the same worn work boots, and these had a different tread pattern, deeper and wider. Someone had been here during the night, walking along the barn's perimeter, stopping at each window to peer inside based on how the prints clustered. My first thought was maybe Frank had come by looking for me, but he always honked his horn at the gate, never just showed up unannounced, especially not in the middle of the night. Over the next few days, more signs appeared that made my gut tighten with unease. The grain shed's padlock, which I always clicked shut out of habit from my uncle's warnings about raccoons, hung open on Wednesday morning. The hasp twisted slightly like someone had used a crowbar on it. My toolbox in the barn had been rifled through, wrenches and screwdrivers arranged differently than how I'd left them, with my good hammer missing entirely. Duke started acting strange too, growling at empty air in the middle of the night, pacing the porch with his ears pinned back, refusing to venture past the yard's edge after sunset. I'd convinced myself it was probably just some drifter passing through, maybe looking for easy pickings or a place to sleep. Nothing more sinister than that. Friday brought the storm, one of those sudden October monsters that rolls down from Canada without warning, turning the sky black by 4 in the afternoon. Rain hammered the metal roof so hard it sounded like gunfire, and the wind bent the old cottonwoods nearly horizontal, their branches scraping against the house like fingernails on wood. I was in the kitchen making dinner, just beans and cornbread since I hadn't made it to town for groceries that week, when Duke started that low, threatening growl he reserved for real danger. He stood facing the living room window, every muscle in his body coiled tight, lips pulled back to show his teeth. Through the rain-blurred glass, I could barely make out the yard, but then I heard it clearly, the unmistakable sound of someone testing the front door handle, a slow, careful turn followed by pressure against the frame. The handle jiggled again, harder this time, and then stopped. Duke's growl deepened as footsteps moved along the porch, heavy boots that didn't care about being quiet anymore, pausing at each window. I grabbed the shotgun from above the refrigerator, checking that both barrels were loaded with the buckshot I kept for coyotes, then killed the kitchen lights. In the darkness, I could track the intruder's movement by sound alone, boots on wood, then the squeak of someone pressing their face against glass trying to see inside. They went around to the side door near the mudroom, rattling that handle too, then to the back door off the kitchen where I stood holding my breath. The knob turned slowly, once, twice, and I could hear breathing on the other side, wet and labored like whoever it was had been running or was excited about something. Duke launched himself at the back door, barking with a fury that made the walls shake, and the footsteps retreated fast, running now toward the barn. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and went to the window, catching a glimpse of a figure in a long, dark coat disappearing into the barn's main entrance, the one I never locked, because the latch had been broken for years. My rational mind said to stay put, wait it out, let whoever it was take what they wanted and leave. But then I heard the crash of breaking glass from the barn, followed by what sounded like feed bags being thrown around. This wasn't just theft anymore. Someone was destroying my property, maybe looking for something specific or just trying to draw me out there. The smart thing would have been to barricade myself in the house, but I'd put too much work into that barn. Too much of my uncle's legacy was stored in there, and anger started mixing with the fear in my chest. I pulled on my rain jacket and headed for the back door, Duke right beside me, his fur already soaked from his earlier barking fit at the door. The second we stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked me sideways, rain hitting my face like cold needles, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We made it halfway to the barn when I saw the broken window on the side, glass shattered inward just like the premise said, and there was blood on the jagged edges, dark and fresh, dripping onto the hay scattered below. Whoever broke in had cut themselves badly, maybe on their hand or arm, and I could see the blood trail leading deeper into the barn. Duke went rigid beside me, a whine escaping his throat, and that's when I noticed the silence. No more crashing, no more movement from inside, just the storm and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I pushed through the barn door, shotgun raised, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal absolute chaos. Feed sacks were slashed open, grain spilling across the floor in golden puddles, tools pulled from their hooks and scattered like someone had been searching frantically for something. The blood trail led toward the back where I kept the old farming equipment, and as I followed it I could hear something else now, a rhythmic thumping coming from outside, from the direction of the storm cellar. The cellar door was around the back of the barn, one of those angled metal doors that led down to the old root storage my uncle had built decades ago, and the sound was definitely someone working on it, trying to pry it open with something heavy. I'd welded that door shut myself just last month after finding a family of possums living down there, so whoever was out there was wasting their time. But the determination in those steady blows made my skin prickle with a different kind of fear. Duke suddenly bolted toward the barn's rear exit, and I followed, rounding the corner to see a man in that long, dark coat hunched over the cellar door, using my missing hammer to beat on the welded locks. His left hand was wrapped in a torn piece of cloth, blood seeping through, and when my flashlight hit him, he spun around fast, revealing a face I recognized but couldn't quite place. Gaunt features, wild gray hair plastered to his skull by the rain, eyes that had that hollow look of someone who'd been living rough for too long. He dropped the hammer and took a step back, raising his good hand like he was surrendering, but his eyes kept darting between me and that cellar door like it held something precious. Then it clicked. This was Walter Briggs, Frank's younger brother who'd disappeared about 3 years back after his wife died. Everyone assumed he'd left the state to start fresh somewhere else. "Walter, what the hell are you doing here?" I kept the shotgun pointed at his chest, trying to make sense of why he'd been stalking my property, why he was so desperate to get into that cellar. He opened his mouth, closed it, then started laughing, this broken sound that competed with the storm's fury. "Your uncle, he promised me," Walter said, his voice hoarse like he hadn't used it in months. "Said if anything happened to him I could have what's down there, said he'd leave a note, instructions. But there was nothing. Nothing in the will, nothing in the house." His injured hand gestured wildly at the cellar door. "I know it's there. I helped him hide it back in '89, 200 grand in cash from that development deal that went bad. Money nobody knew about. Money that should have been mine too since I introduced him to those investors." The pieces started falling into place. My uncle's sudden ability to buy new equipment despite claiming poverty, his paranoid behavior in his final years, always checking locks, installing security lights that I'd thought were excessive for a remote farm. Walter took another step back, stumbling slightly, and I could see he was in bad shape. Probably hadn't eaten properly in days, that hand needing medical attention before infection set in. "I've been living in the old Mitchell place," he said, naming an abandoned farmhouse about 10 miles north that had been empty since I was a kid. "Been watching, waiting for you to leave for supplies. But you never stay away long enough for me to break through that weld. Tonight, with the storm, I thought maybe you wouldn't hear me working on it." Duke kept growling, staying between Walter and me, and I had to make a decision fast because this situation could go bad quickly with a desperate, injured man who'd been living on the edge for years. "Walter, there's no money down there," I said, though honestly I had no idea what my uncle might have hidden. "I cleaned it out when I moved in. Just old canning jars and rusted tools, nothing worth risking your life over." His face crumpled like I'd just told him his family had died all over again, and he sank to his knees in the mud, that injured hand cradled against his chest. I lowered the shotgun slightly, seeing him broken like that in the rain, and made a choice that probably saved both our lives that night. "Come inside, let me look at that hand," I said, surprising myself with the offer. "We'll call Frank, get you somewhere warm and dry, get you some help." Walter looked up at me with those hollow eyes, then nodded slowly, all the fight drained out of him. We walked back to the house together, Duke keeping a watchful eye on our unexpected guest, and I bandaged his hand while coffee brewed, the storm still raging outside. Frank arrived 2 hours later in his truck, having fought through flooded roads to get there, and the brothers had a conversation I pretended not to hear, lots of tears and apologies and promises to get help. Before they left, Walter told me exactly where my uncle had put the money, behind a false wall in the cellar's northeast corner. Said I'd earned it by showing him kindness when I could have done much worse. After they drove away, I sat in my kitchen until dawn, thinking about that money supposedly hidden beneath my feet, about secrets and promises, and what desperation could drive a person to do. When the sun finally came up, I walked out to the barn with Duke, grabbed a sledgehammer, and went to work on that cellar door. Not sure what I'd find, but knowing I needed to see for myself what had driven Walter to the edge of sanity. The cellar was exactly as I'd left it before welding it shut, musty and filled with broken shelving, except for the northeast corner Walter had described. Behind what looked like solid stone, I found a narrow gap, and inside that gap, wrapped in plastic and duct tape, was more money than I'd ever seen in one place. Not quite 200 grand anymore. Time and moisture had damaged some bills despite the wrapping, but enough to change everything if I wanted it to. I stood there for a long time, holding those bundles of cash that had cost Walter his sanity and my uncle his peace of mind, understanding finally why the old man had become so paranoid near the end. That afternoon, I drove to Frank's place where Walter was resting, handed him half the money in a duffel bag, and told him my uncle would have wanted him to have it, which might have been true or might have been my way of buying back my own peace of mind. Walter ended up checking into a treatment facility in Billings, got himself sorted out, and last I heard he was living with his daughter in Oregon, working at her hardware store, trying to make up for the lost years. I used my half to fix up the farm properly, installed a real security system, and adopted 2 more dogs from the shelter because Duke deserved some backup after that night. Sometimes I still hear sounds outside during storms, but now it's just the wind or animals seeking shelter, nothing more sinister than nature doing what nature does, and I sleep better knowing that some secrets are better shared than buried, even if it takes a desperate night and a bloody hand to bring them to light. When I bought the Hutchins property in February 2023, everyone in town told me I got a steal. The old man had died alone in January, no kids, distant relatives who just wanted it gone. 39 acres of decent farmland in central Pennsylvania for less than most people pay for a starter home. I'd been saving since my late 20s, working construction in Philadelphia, dreaming of having my own place where I could fix things with my hands and not answer to anyone. The house needed work but had good bones. The workshop out back, though, that's where things got complicated. It was a separate building about 50 yards from the main house. Metal siding painted barn red, windows so caked with grime you couldn't see inside. The real estate agent said the old man used it for storage, hadn't been opened in years. I figured I'd clean it out, turn it into a proper workspace for woodworking, maybe build furniture to sell at the farmer's market in town. The first time I stepped inside that workshop, the smell hit me like a physical thing. Not decay exactly, more like decades of stale air, motor oil, and something else I couldn't place. Mustiness mixed with old leather and dust so thick it coated my teeth. There were tools everywhere, most of them rusted, hanging on pegboards or scattered across a workbench that ran the length of the back wall. Boxes of old tractor parts, coils of wire, mason jars filled with nails and screws. Pretty standard stuff for a farm workshop. The concrete floor was cracked in places, stained dark with what I assumed was oil or transmission fluid. I spent the first few days just hauling junk out, filling the bed of my truck over and over, making runs to the county dump. My nearest neighbor, an older guy named Eugene who ran cattle on the property next door, would wave from his tractor when he saw me working. He'd known the previous owner, said he'd been a quiet man, kept to himself, didn't cause trouble. That's how people described everyone out here, it seemed. Quiet, kept to themselves. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, maybe 2 weeks into clearing out the workshop, when I noticed the floor wasn't level. Not in an old building settling kind of way, but deliberately uneven. There was a section near the back corner, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, where the concrete sat slightly higher than the rest, like someone had poured a patch job years ago and hadn't bothered to smooth it out properly. When I swept the area clean, I could see the seam where new concrete met old, The color was different too, lighter gray, not as weathered. I grabbed a pry bar from my truck and started chipping at the edge, curious more than anything. The concrete was only a couple inches thick, not the proper 4 or 5 you'd expect. Underneath wasn't gravel or dirt. It was wood. Plywood, specifically, cut to fit the space and laid flat. My brain started working through possibilities. Maybe an old root cellar, or a spot where the original floor had rotted through. But why cover it with such a thin layer of concrete? Why not fix it properly? I pulled up the plywood sheets. They came away easily, practically fell apart in my hands from moisture damage. The smell that came up from below made me gag and step back, one hand covering my mouth and nose. It wasn't death, nothing like the dead raccoon I'd found in the house chimney. This was earthier, damper, like opening a grave that had been sealed for decades. The hole below was maybe 4 feet deep, barely enough to qualify as a crawl space. The walls raw dirt held back by old 2x4s. It was dark down there, even with the afternoon sun coming through the workshop windows. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, leaned over the edge to look down. At first, I just saw dirt and more wood, some kind of shelf or platform built into the space. Then I saw the box. It was plastic, one of those weatherproof storage containers you'd buy at a hardware store, gray with yellow latches. It sat on the wooden platform like someone had placed it there carefully, deliberately. No dust on the lid. Someone had been down there recently, or at least more recently than the concrete patch suggested. I should have called someone right then. Looking back, that would have been the smart move. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I was alone out there on 39 acres with no one around to tell me not to climb down into that hole. I lowered myself in, feet first, my boots landing on the wooden platform with a soft thud that sent vibrations through the dirt walls. The space was cramped, ceiling so low I had to crouch. The air was thick and hard to breathe, like being buried alive. I reached for the box, popped the yellow latches, lifted the lid. The smell hit me first, not rot but something chemical, like old perfume mixed with must and plastic. Inside were Ziploc bags, the gallon-size kind, each one labeled with black marker. Names and dates. Melissa, July 1994. Amber, November 1996. Christine, May 1998. There were 7 bags total, each one containing items that made my chest tighten. A driver's license, a necklace with a small silver cross, a hair tie, a pack of cigarettes, disposable cameras, the kind you'd buy at a gas station and drop off at a drugstore to get developed. One bag had a hospital wristband, the paper kind that disintegrates if you wear it too long, but this one was preserved, sealed away from air and time. I lifted one of the cameras, turned it over in my hands. It was light, probably no film left inside, or maybe never used at all. The bag labeled Christine had a Pennsylvania driver's license, the old style from the 90s with the Keystone logo in the corner. Her photo showed a girl with blonde hair and a shy smile, 21 years old when the picture was taken. The license had expired in 2001. Inside the same bag was a thin silver bracelet with a charm shaped like a sunflower, and a paper napkin from a place called Bernie's Roadhouse with a phone number written in blue ink. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was holding. These weren't things someone throws away. These were kept, treasured even, in the most horrifying way possible. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking now despite myself, and started taking pictures of everything. Each bag, each item, the labels with those names and dates. The crawl space suddenly seemed smaller, the air thinner, and I realized I needed to get out of there before I passed out or worse. I climbed out of that hole faster than I went in. The box clutched against my chest and walked straight to my truck without looking back at the workshop. My fingers were trembling so badly it took 3 tries to unlock my phone and dial 911. The dispatcher asked if there was an emergency, if anyone was hurt, and I didn't know how to answer that. Were these women hurt? They had to be. People don't lose their driver's licenses and precious jewelry and end up fine. I told her I'd found something on my property, something the police needed to see immediately. and she must have heard the panic in my voice because she didn't ask more questions, just said units were on the way. I sat in my truck with the doors locked, the box on the passenger seat, staring at the workshop like it might come alive and swallow me whole. 20 minutes felt like hours. When the county sheriff finally pulled up the gravel driveway, lights flashing but no siren, I practically ran to meet him. The sheriff's name was Daniels, a broad-shouldered man probably in his mid-50s with gray stubble and tired eyes that had seen too much. He listened to my explanation, looked at the box, then called for backup before we even went back to the workshop. Within an hour, my property was swarming with deputies, state police, people in plain clothes who I assumed were detectives. They taped off the entire workshop, brought in portable lights, and started photographing everything. A detective named Warren pulled me aside, asked me to walk him through exactly what happened, step by step. I told him about the uneven floor, the concrete patch, the plywood, climbing down into the crawl space. He wrote everything down in a small notebook, his pen moving quickly across the page. When I mentioned the names and dates on the bags, his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, like he'd been waiting for this call for a very long time. Warren told me they'd run the names through their database, see if anything came up. He asked me not to leave town, standard procedure, he said, though I could tell he didn't consider me a suspect. I was just the unlucky bastard who bought the wrong piece of land. They kept me there for hours, asking the same questions different ways, making sure my story stayed consistent. By the time they let me go back to the house, the sun was setting and more vehicles had arrived, including a white van with forensic unit printed on the side. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee, watching the lights from the workshop area sweep back and forth across my yard like searchlights. The next morning, Warren came to the house and asked if we could talk. He had a folder with him, thick with papers and photographs. He sat across from me at that same kitchen table and opened it carefully, like he was handling something fragile. The first photo he showed me was a missing person flyer from 1994. Melissa Hartley, 23 years old, last seen hitchhiking along Route 15 near Lewisburg. Blonde hair, green eyes, wearing a denim jacket and carrying a backpack. She'd been traveling from State College to visit her sister in Harrisburg and never arrived. Warren laid out more photos, more flyers. Amber Sutton disappeared in 1996 while walking home from her shift at a truck stop diner outside Sunbury. Christine Porter, the one whose license I'd held in my hands, vanished in 1998 after her car broke down on a rural road near Selinsgrove. 4 more women, all between 1994 and 2001, all from small towns within a 50-mile radius of where I was sitting. All cases that had gone cold decades ago, filed away in boxes in some basement evidence room, families still wondering, still hoping. Warren explained that they'd suspected a serial predator back then, someone who knew the area, knew the back roads, knew how to move without being noticed. But they never had physical evidence, never had a suspect, never had anything except missing women and grieving families. Until now. The items in that box matched personal effects reported missing with each woman. The disposable cameras were being sent to a lab to see if any images could be recovered. They'd already started excavating the property, bringing in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. Warren's voice was steady when he told me this, professional, but I could see the weight of it in his eyes. They found the first remains 3 days later, buried in a shallow grave near the tree line at the edge of the property, maybe 200 yards from the workshop. Then another. Then 2 more in a section of woods I'd never even walked through yet. The forensic teams worked for weeks, grid by grid, marking spots with little flags whenever the dogs alerted or the radar showed anomalies. I stayed in a motel in town during most of it. Couldn't stomach being in that house knowing what was underneath my land. The media picked up the story fast. News vans lined the road outside the property, reporters doing stand-ups with my barn in the background, helicopters circling overhead. I stopped reading the articles, stopped watching the coverage. They were calling him the Route 15 killer, even though Warren told me they'd probably never know his real hunting grounds, how far his territory actually stretched. The old man who owned the place, Howard Brennan, had died of a heart attack in his living room with no one around. Convenient, Warren said bitterly. No trial, no confession, no answers for the families about what happened to their daughters and sisters. By the time the investigation officially concluded in early June, they'd recovered the remains of 6 women from my property. One was still missing, and Warren believed she might be buried somewhere else, maybe on land that had since been developed or sold off. The families were notified, given what closure could be offered after so many years of not knowing. Some of them reached out to me, sent letters thanking me for making the call, for not just covering the hole back up and pretending I'd never seen it. I didn't feel like I deserved thanks. I just did what anyone would do, what anyone should do. The property sat empty for months after that. I couldn't sell it, not with its history plastered across every news site in the state. Eventually, I hired a crew to tear down the workshop, haul away every piece of metal and wood, and pour new concrete over where it had stood. The house I kept, though I've never spent another night there. I rented out now to a young couple who knew the story and didn't care. Said they didn't believe in ghosts or bad energy. Maybe they're right. Maybe it's just land, just a house, just wood and nails and dirt. But I know what was hidden there. I know those women deserved better than to disappear into the soil of some quiet farm where nobody thought to look. Every time I drive past on my way to visit Eugene next door, I see those yellow flags in my mind, dotting the landscape like terrible flowers, marking spots where lives ended and secrets stayed buried for 30 years. Running a small farm alone wasn't something I planned, but after my divorce went through in 2015, keeping the property felt like the only stable thing left in my life. 40 acres of corn and soybeans in rural Alabama, a white farmhouse that creaked in the wind, and a barn that desperately needed new doors. Most of the year I could manage everything myself, but harvest season always demanded extra hands. That's why I posted the job listing at the feed store in July 2023, looking for 2 temporary workers to help bring in the crops before the weather turned. I got a handful of responses, and after a few phone calls, I settled on hiring 2 guys who seemed capable enough. One was a college kid named Austin, who needed summer money before heading back to school. The other was a man who introduced himself as Elliot, maybe in his mid-40s, with a handshake that lasted a second too long and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. The first week went fine, or at least I thought it did. Austin was chatty and worked hard, always asking if he could take water breaks or use the bathroom, polite in that way young people are when they're trying to make a good impression. Elliot, though, he worked in silence mostly, but every now and then he'd pause what he was doing and just watch me. Not in an obvious way, but I'd turn around while hauling a basket of tools and catch him staring from across the field, hands on his hips, like he was studying something. He started asking questions by the 3rd day, casual at first. What time did I usually wake up? Did I lock all the doors at night? Was the house alarmed? When I told him that was none of his business, he just smiled and said he was asking because he worried about me being out here alone, that a woman by herself needed to be careful. The way he said alone made my stomach tighten, like he was confirming something he already knew. I brushed it off, told myself I was being paranoid, that he was just making conversation. But then he asked about the layout of the house, whether the bedroom was upstairs or down, and if the back door had a deadbolt or just a regular lock. By the end of that first week, I started noticing Elliot lingering after Austin left for the day. Austin would wave goodbye, hop in his beat-up sedan, and drive off down the dirt road, but Elliot always found a reason to stick around an extra 20 minutes. He'd say he needed to finish organizing tools in the barn, or that he wanted to check the irrigation lines one more time, but I'd see him through the kitchen window just standing there, looking at the house. Not working, not moving, just standing with his hands in his pockets and his head tilted like he was memorizing something. One evening I walked out to tell him it was time to go, and he was standing right by the porch steps, close enough that I nearly ran into him. He didn't apologize or step back. He just looked at me and said he'd been wondering if I ever got scared out here, if I ever heard strange noises at night. When I told him no, and that he needed to leave, he nodded slowly, said goodnight, and walked toward his truck. But he kept turning around every few steps to look back at the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified, the house settling, branches scraping the siding, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Around midnight, I heard something that made me sit straight up in bed, a slow, deliberate crunch of gravel outside, like someone taking careful steps to avoid making noise. I got up and moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see out into the yard. The motion sensor light by the barn hadn't triggered, so whoever or whatever it was hadn't gotten close enough yet. But I could see a shape moving along the tree line, slow and methodical, tracing the perimeter of the property. My first thought was a deer or maybe a coyote. We got those sometimes. But the movement was wrong. It was too steady, too purposeful. The shape stopped near the side of the house, right below my bedroom window, and just stood there. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After what felt like forever, the shape moved again, heading toward the front porch, and I heard the soft creak of the wooden steps under weight. Footsteps. Human footsteps. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and pulled up the security camera app I'd installed a few months back. Nothing fancy. Just a single camera pointed at the front door that recorded to the cloud. The feed loaded slowly, buffering in that maddening way it does when you need it most. And when the image finally appeared, my chest went tight. There was Elliot, standing directly in front of the camera, staring straight into the lens. Not moving, not knocking, just standing there with his face maybe 6 inches from the camera, close enough that I could see the reflection of the porch light in his eyes. His expression was blank, completely neutral, like he was waiting for something or testing something. I watched, frozen, as he stayed there for what must have been 30 seconds, and then the feed flickered once, twice, and went black. The app said "connection lost" in gray text at the bottom of the screen. I tried refreshing it, closing and reopening the app, even restarting my phone, but the camera wouldn't come back online. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone. The next morning I went outside to check the camera, and the lens was covered in a smear of something, mud or grease, I couldn't tell, but it had been deliberately wiped across it so the camera couldn't record anything clearly. The memory card inside was gone too, popped right out of the slot and taken. I stood there on the porch staring at the empty slot, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over me. This wasn't random. This wasn't some confused drifter who wandered onto my property. Elliot had walked the perimeter of my house in the middle of the night, stood outside my bedroom window, climbed my porch steps, disabled my only security measure, and stolen the evidence. When he and Austin showed up for work an hour later, Elliot looked exactly the same as always, calm and quiet, offering me a polite nod as he grabbed his gloves from the barn. I wanted to scream at him, to demand what the hell he thought he was doing, but something in the way he looked at me, steady and patient, made the words catch in my throat. Austin was oblivious, talking about some party he'd gone to over the weekend, but Elliot just worked in silence, occasionally glancing toward the house like he was checking on it. I decided right then that I needed to fire him, had to get him off my property before things got worse. Around lunchtime, I pulled him aside, away from Austin, and told him as calmly as I could manage that I didn't need his help anymore, that I'd pay him for the week, but he should collect his things and go. The change in his face was immediate. That blank, neutral expression twisted into something darker, his jaw tightening and his eyes narrowing like I'd just insulted him. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the sweat and dirt on him, and said in a low voice that he didn't take orders from people who hide things. I had no idea what he meant, and I told him so, but he just shook his head slowly and said I knew exactly what he was talking about. When I insisted he leave, he crossed his arms and said no. Just like that. No. He said he had every right to be here, that he'd signed on for the whole harvest season, and if I tried to force him off the property, he'd make sure everyone in town knew what kind of person I really was. The threat was vague enough that it didn't make sense, but specific enough that it scared me. He wasn't yelling, wasn't being violent, but the way he stood there, immovable and confident, made it clear he had no intention of leaving. That afternoon, I called the sheriff's office, explained the situation as best I could without sounding hysterical. The deputy who answered said unless Elliot had physically threatened me or damaged my property, there wasn't much they could do. Trespassing required him to refuse to leave after being formally warned, and since he was technically still employed, even if I wanted him gone, it was a civil matter. He suggested I document everything, maybe get a restraining order if things escalated, but that could take days to process. I hung up feeling helpless and furious, trapped on my own land with someone who clearly had plans I couldn't begin to understand. Austin finished up his work around 4 and headed home like usual, waving goodbye and saying he'd see me the next day. Elliot, though, he stayed. He didn't even pretend to work. He just sat on an overturned bucket near the barn, facing the house, watching me through the kitchen window as I moved around inside. When I turned off the lights and went upstairs, I saw his truck still parked by the road, headlights off, just sitting there in the dusk like a predator waiting for night to fall. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the hallway upstairs with a baseball bat across my lap and my phone in my hand, listening to every sound the house made. Around 11, I heard the gravel driveway crunch, slow and deliberate, the same pattern as the night before. Then came the sound of the barn doors creaking open, the old metal hinges groaning in protest. He was inside the barn. I could picture him in there, moving through the shadows, maybe looking through my tools, my supplies, learning the space. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and then I heard footsteps on the gravel again, circling around the side of the house. They stopped right below the bathroom window, and I heard a faint scraping sound, like something metal dragging across the siding. My whole body was tense, every muscle locked, waiting for the sound of breaking glass or a door being forced open. Instead, the footsteps moved again, this time toward the back of the house. I heard the back door handle twist. Once, twice, testing it. I'd locked it, I knew I had, but hearing someone try it anyway made my breath come in short, panicked gasps. The handle stopped moving, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then I heard his voice, muffled through the door but clear enough to understand. He said he knew I was awake, that he could see the light from my phone glowing in the upstairs window. He said I should just let him in so we could talk, that he wasn't trying to scare me. He just wanted to have a conversation about things I'd been keeping from him. I had no idea what he meant, and I didn't answer. My throat was too tight to speak, and even if I could, I wasn't going to engage with him. After another long silence, I heard his footsteps retreat across the gravel, but they didn't go far. They stopped somewhere near the side yard, and then I heard the soft click of a lighter and smelled cigarette smoke drifting through the window screen. He was smoking out there, just standing in my yard in the middle of the night like he owned the place. I stayed frozen in that hallway until the sun started to rise, and when I finally looked out the window, his truck was gone. I called my brother in Georgia the second it was a decent hour, and he drove up that same day with 2 of his friends, both big guys who worked construction. I told them everything, showed them the disabled camera, described the nights of stalking and the refusal to leave. When Elliot showed up for work that afternoon, he saw the 3 of them standing on my porch with their arms crossed, and for the first time since I'd met him, his expression changed. The confidence drained out of his face, replaced by something cautious, almost nervous. My brother walked right up to him and told him in no uncertain terms that he was done here, that if he ever set foot on this property again or came within a mile of me, they'd make sure he regretted it. Elliot didn't argue, he didn't say a word. He just stared at me for a long moment, like he was memorizing my face, then turned and walked back to his truck. He drove off slowly, and I watched until his taillights disappeared down the road. For the next week, my brother and his friends stayed with me, sleeping in the guest room and taking shifts, keeping watch at night. Elliot never came back. I checked with Austin a few days later, and he said Elliot had called him once, asking weird questions about whether I'd said anything about him, whether the police had been involved, but Austin told him he didn't know anything and to stop calling. I changed all the locks on the house, installed 3 new cameras with backup power supplies, and got a dog, a German shepherd named Juno who barks at everything that moves. The barn doors got new locks too, industrial-strength deadbolts that can't be opened from the outside. I eventually finished the harvest with Austin's help, and a couple of day laborers from a staffing agency that actually ran background checks. I never found out what Elliot meant by his accusations, what he thought I was hiding, and honestly, I don't care. Maybe he was delusional, maybe he was on something, or maybe he was just a dangerous man looking for a vulnerable target. Whatever it was, I got lucky that my brother showed up when he did. Even now, a year later, I still think about those nights. I think about how close I came to being completely alone with someone who had studied my routines, disabled my security, and refused to leave even when told directly. I think about the way he tested that back door handle, the way he stood in my yard smoking a cigarette like he had all the time in the world. The worst part isn't even what happened. It's knowing how much worse it could have been if I hadn't made that call, if my brother hadn't dropped everything to help me. I don't hire temporary workers anymore. I either do the harvest myself, or I pay a professional crew with insurance and references I can verify. Juno sleeps at the foot of my bed every night, and I still check the cameras obsessively before I go to sleep, watching the feeds until I'm sure nothing's moving out there in the dark. People ask me sometimes if I ever saw Elliot again, if he ever came back, and the answer is no. But I still lock every door twice, and I still wake up at the smallest sound, and I probably always will. Life on our farm had been running in a steady rhythm when all of this happened. I'd been juggling chores, raising 2 kids, and helping my spouse plan a long overdue remodel of the old farmhouse bedroom. The place was built in the 1950s and still carried that stubborn, creaky personality of homes that have seen too many seasons. We'd talked for years about opening up that room to make space for a proper desk and some shelves, since the kids kept spreading their school projects all over the kitchen table. That morning felt ordinary enough. Sunlight coming through the kitchen window, the smell of coffee drifting through the hall, nothing hinting that the day would take such a sharp turn. The crew we hired was small, just 2 workers, both locals who had fixed half the barns within a 20-mile radius. One of them, a guy named Shane, had a habit of humming old country tunes while he worked, which always echoed weirdly in the narrow hallway. I remember carrying a basket of laundry when I heard his humming stop all at once. Not like he took a break, more like his attention got yanked away by something he didn't expect. By the time I walked toward the bedroom, he was standing on a ladder with a piece of drywall still in his hand, staring at a dark recess in the wall like he'd stumbled onto a tunnel. Bits of insulation were floating in the air, drifting down like strange yellow snowflakes. I asked him if everything was okay, and he answered in this strange half-whisper, telling me he'd found a hollow pocket sealed off behind the studs. It wasn't part of the room's layout. It shouldn't have existed. He pulled his flashlight from his belt and tilted it inside the space. From where I stood, I could smell something damp, stale, almost like a cellar no one had touched in decades. He climbed down and motioned for me to stay back, and that was the moment the air around us seemed to stretch thin. A moment later, he reached into the cavity and stepped away fast, dropping a sheet-wrapped bundle onto the tarp. The bundle wasn't big, no more than the size of a household pillow, but the corners sagged in a way that made my knees feel weak. When he peeled the sheet open just enough to see what was inside, the room felt smaller than it had ever been. It wasn't a full skeleton, not neatly arranged, just a cluster of small bones gathered together, tangled in a mold-stained bedsheet. The fabric looked older than anything in that house, the kind of decay you only see when time has been eating away in secret. The worker didn't touch anything again, and I remember stepping back until my shoulder hit the hallway wall. My mind kept trying to attach a logical explanation. Animals, debris, some bizarre mistake. But deep down, I already understood this was no accident. Within minutes, we'd called the sheriff's office, and that normal, peaceful morning evaporated into something I still think about every single night. The deputies arrived quicker than I expected, their boots leaving dusty prints along our hallway runner. One of them, a woman named Deputy Marin, crouched beside the bundle with a steadiness that didn't quite match the tension in her jaw. She didn't touch the bones, just studied them, shining her flashlight in small, controlled motions. The other deputy stood near the window, scribbling something in his notebook while asking basic questions about the remodel, about when the wall had last been opened, about the house's previous owners. I kept thinking about how many mornings I'd walked past that very spot in the wall without knowing there was a person, or what remained of one, sealed inside for who knows how long. By mid-afternoon, detectives joined the deputies, along with a crime scene tech who laid out a blue tarp and started photographing every angle of the cavity. They moved carefully, almost reverently, like they didn't want to disturb the quiet lingering in the home's bones. The lead detective, a man named Harris, spoke calmly as he explained they suspected the remains belonged to a woman who had vanished ages ago. He didn't give many details at first, but his tone carried the weight of something long forgotten, or purposely buried. He asked if I'd heard anything strange from neighbors about the property's past. I told him the truth. We'd heard bits and pieces, mostly old gossip about a previous owner who drank too much and argued loudly with his wife, but no one ever hinted at anything like this. Later that evening, the techs finally removed the bones, still wrapped in the decayed sheet, placing them into a container that looked too clinical for something that carried so much human sadness. Watching them carry it through the hallway felt surreal, especially with my kids sitting quietly in the living room, sensing the heaviness in the air. Detective Harris stayed behind to walk through the rest of the house with me and my spouse, asking about odd structural quirks, any renovations done before we moved in, or stories the realtor had shared. At one point, he paused near the back door, tapping the frame as if something about the house was speaking to him in a language he recognized. The next day, neighbors started showing up, not in a nosy way, but with this cautious curiosity, like they were stepping into a story they'd tried to forget. An older man from down the road, Mick, leaned on our porch railing and told the detectives the former owner had been infamous for his temper. He described nights when shouting carried across the fields, followed by stretches of silence so long they made the livestock restless. Another neighbor, Janet, mentioned how the owner's wife had left suddenly decades ago, with no forwarding address and no goodbyes. People assumed she'd run off to escape the chaos of her marriage, and no one questioned it because back then, questioning meant getting involved in someone else's firestorm. Hearing them talk, piece by piece, felt like watching a puzzle assemble itself into an image no one wanted to see. Detective Harris returned 2 days later with a quiet seriousness that made me set aside everything I was doing. He explained that the remains had been confirmed as belonging to the woman neighbors remembered, the one everyone believed had simply packed up and left. He told us the way she was found, wrapped tightly and placed inside a sealed cavity, suggested she hadn't gone anywhere by choice. Hearing that said out loud made the house feel heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He asked me to walk him through the moment the workers opened the wall again, and even though I'd already told the story several times, repeating it to him felt different. There was something in his eyes that made it clear this case wasn't going to fade quietly. A few evenings later, after the kids went to bed, my spouse and I sat in the living room talking about everything the investigation had stirred up. I kept glancing toward the closed bedroom door, imagining the empty cavity behind the studs. The space looked harmless now, just wood and wiring, yet my mind kept circling back to the idea that someone had sealed that woman away, likely in a moment of rage or fear, and gone on living in the house as if nothing had happened. I couldn't stop wondering how many arguments, how many slammed doors, how many desperate moments had happened in those same rooms before we ever set foot inside. The thought clung to me like humidity before a storm. The detectives eventually pieced together a rough timeline. Based on the neighbors' recollections and records from old hospital visits and police calls, the former owner had been spiraling for years. They believed the crime happened during one of his violent episodes. He had died several years before we bought the place, and whatever secrets he carried were buried with him, at least until our renovation peeled back the layers he'd left behind. Learning that there would be no confession, no confrontation, no real explanation left a strange hollowness inside me. Justice felt incomplete, like a door left slightly open without anyone willing to close it. Over the following weeks, we finished the remodel, though the room never felt the same. The drywall was new, the paint fresh, but every time I stepped inside, I felt a faint heaviness in the air. Not fear exactly, but a deep awareness of the past. Sometimes, when the house settled at night and the wood popped the way old houses do, I'd picture the woman who never got the chance to leave the farm alive. We added a small framed wildflower print to the new shelf in her memory, even though we never knew her name personally. It seemed wrong to pretend nothing had happened, and yet life continued, kids doing homework, meals on the stove, the dogs barking at passing tractors. The house had carried a terrible secret for decades, but now that it had been uncovered, all we could do was acknowledge it and move forward. Growing up around farmland shaped the kind of person I became, but I never imagined I'd end up owning a place with a reputation whispered about in diners and gas stations. When I took over that property, I was juggling 2 part-time jobs and trying to stabilize my life after a messy breakup, so I didn't have the luxury of giving in to local rumors. The cornfield behind the house had this odd habit of sagging in the same area every warm season, creating a shallow dip no matter how often I tried to level it out. Neighbors told me the previous operator never managed to fix it either, but I assumed it was just years of sloppy irrigation. At that point, I was focused on catching up on bills, keeping the equipment running, and convincing myself I hadn't made a stupid financial decision. The land looked healthy enough, and nothing about that sinking patch seemed dangerous, just annoying and inconvenient. By the time early summer rolled around, I finally saved enough to bring in a small crew to help regrade the field properly. The morning they arrived, I remember feeling this strange mix of relief and embarrassment. Relief because the problem would finally be dealt with, and embarrassment because the crew leader, a guy named Spencer, kept pointing out the signs of past erosion that I should have noticed myself. As they started moving soil, the machinery kept giving off this uneven groan, the kind it makes when it's fighting something that shouldn't be there. I figured it was just compacted earth or some old farm debris, maybe forgotten fence posts or rusted tools buried over time. Still, watching the blade screech as it scraped against something solid made me shift my weight from one foot to the other, unsure if we were about to uncover a rock the size of a fridge or a damaged pipe, waiting to explode water everywhere. It didn't take long before the crew realized the obstacle wasn't stone or metal piping. When the machine lifted its blade again, there was a faint clank, the kind that sounded too smooth, too deliberate to be scrap. Spencer waved me over and pointed to a thin sliver of metal poking through the dirt, perfectly straight and coated in this dull bluish gray that didn't match anything used on the farm. The workers formed a loose semicircle, muttering guesses to each other while scraping the soil away by hand. Even from a few feet back, I could tell whatever we'd hit wasn't small. A rectangular outline began to appear, corners sharp enough to stand out from the surrounding earth. One of the younger workers asked if I had ever buried equipment out here, and I laughed in a way that didn't feel natural, mostly to hide the tension building behind my ribs. The moment they uncovered the front grille, even partially, everything around us went strangely quiet. I recognized the shape instantly. The nose of a pickup truck wedged upright in the ground like someone had dropped it from the sky. The metal was warped in places, caked with soil, but the brand emblem was still visible despite the grime. Spencer kept brushing away dirt, eventually revealing the windshield, or what was left of it. The glass had shattered ages ago, leaving jagged edges embedded in the frame. When he aimed his flashlight into the cabin, Nobody spoke for a good 10 seconds. Inside, slumped against the steering column, was a human shape still buckled in place. The clothing was faded and barely recognizable, but the outline of a body was unmistakable. I felt this tightening inside my chest, not from fear exactly, but from the abrupt realization that the land I'd been tending like it was mine alone had been hiding someone's final moments. News travels fast in small communities, and within an hour the property felt less like my farm and more like a crime scene. Patrol cars rolled down the gravel path one after another, kicking up dust that clung to the air like powder. An officer directed me to stand near the fence while they set up a perimeter, and I remember gripping the wood rail, trying to process the idea that this field had been holding someone's secret for so long. The sheriff on site, a man named Hendrik, asked a handful of routine questions, but his expression grew sharper the moment I mentioned the name of the farm's previous operator. I'd always known the man by reputation only, someone people described with vague discomfort, the type who made deals in back rooms and avoided eye contact. I had no idea that what he left behind might be more than neglected machinery and unpaid debts. When the crew finally managed to widen the dig site enough to pull the truck free, the vertical orientation became even more unsettling. It stood almost perfectly straight when they lifted it with the winch, like some grave marker that had been hidden under the soil. Hendrik kept pacing around it with the kind of focus I'd only ever seen in people trying to piece together something bigger than a simple accident. A forensic tech leaned inside the cab and confirmed that the driver had never escaped, never even unbuckled. The position of the body suggested a sudden impact, but the angle and depth in which the truck was buried made the explanation impossible to accept as an accident. By that point, a few locals had gathered near the road, each one talking in low tones, throwing uneasy glances my way, as if I were somehow responsible for not knowing what had been beneath my own land. Later that afternoon, investigators traced the license plate and matched the truck to a missing persons case that had nearly slipped out of collective memory. The owner was identified as Joel Mercer, a guy who'd vanished 2 decades earlier after leaving a bar on the edge of town. I'd heard his name once or twice in passing, mostly in stories older men told after a couple drinks, nameless warnings about choosing better company and not trusting certain folks. Hendrik explained that Joel had been involved in a confrontation shortly before he disappeared, a heated argument with the man who used to run my farm. Apparently, Joel had accused him of dealing in stolen vehicles, but no one ever proved anything. When Joel never came home, the theory that he'd run off on his own became the easiest one to accept, especially once the farm changed hands and that whole chapter faded into rumor. What unsettled me most was realizing how often I'd walked across that sinking patch, how many mornings I'd passed over it with coffee in hand, without noticing anything more than a soft depression in the earth. The idea that a man had been trapped down there while seasons changed overhead gave me a sense of weight I couldn't explain. Investigators kept expanding the search radius, combing through the rest of the field as if expecting to find more surprises. Watching heavy machinery peel back layers of soil made the farm feel unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Even the air felt different, as though the land itself had been waiting for someone to uncover its history and finally acknowledge the truth buried beneath it. As the evening stretched on, Hendrik pulled me aside and told me something that still clings to my thoughts whenever I walk that field. Years ago, before the farm changed owners, neighbors had reported hearing machinery running long after midnight, engines revving, metal clanging, strange activity with headlights sweeping across the corn rows. Most assumed the operator was working odd hours because he was difficult to deal with and preferred avoiding people. No one imagined those late nights might have involved burying a truck vertically with someone inside. The sheriff's tone implied he believed the man had help, or at least enough privacy to carry out something so heavy and deliberate. Standing there in the fading light, I couldn't stop imagining the moment the ground swallowed Joel's truck, how quickly the soil must have collapsed around it, erasing every trace until only that slow seasonal sinking hinted at what lay beneath. The authorities wrapped up their work sometime after nightfall, leaving deep trenches and equipment tracks carved across the field. For the first time since buying the place, I didn't feel any attachment to the land, just a strange heaviness, like the farm had been carrying a burden and had finally dropped it into my hands. Word spread through town that more arrests might follow, that people connected to the former operator were being questioned. A detective mentioned that receipts, forged documents, and scrap parts had surfaced in places no one expected. Every new detail pushed the story further away from simple tragedy and closer to a network of crimes that had been overlooked for far too long. Meanwhile, Joel's family was located and notified, reopening wounds they thought had finally scarred over. Over the next week, I struggled to resume anything resembling routine. Walking into the barn felt different. Stepping outside at dawn felt different. Even simple chores made me overly aware of the ground beneath my boots. I kept thinking about the years Joel spent hidden below the soil while life continued overhead. Birthdays, storms, new owners, harvest seasons. The crew eventually filled the massive excavation and leveled the ground again, but the land never returned to how it looked before. The patch where the truck had been removed settled unevenly, creating a subtle ridge instead of a dip. I didn't bother correcting it. Maybe part of me felt the land deserved to keep a scar of its own, something honest that marked what had happened instead of swallowing it again. A month later, after all the interviews, reports, and cleanup, the sheriff returned to hand me the last of the paperwork. He told me the case would finally be closed soon, and that the former operator, now living far from here, was facing charges connected not only to Joel but to several vehicles reported stolen around the same period. Hearing that brought me a kind of closure I didn't expect. I stood there with the folder in my hand, looking out across the cornfield while the wind moved through the rows like a slow hush. The land felt quieter than before, almost as though it had released something old and heavy. I still don't understand every piece of what happened on that property long before I arrived, but at least the truth isn't buried anymore. And strangely, that makes it easier to live here now, even if I'll never walk that field again without thinking of the man who never made it home. Something about that morning still clings to me. Maybe because life on the ranch had finally started to feel steady again after a messy stretch of debts and repairs. I'd taken over the place from an older couple who moved south to be closer to their grandkids, and they left behind a few things they figured I'd grow into, including a big livestock guardian dog named Ranger. He had a blocky head, pale eyes that always looked half-focused on something far away, and a habit of pacing the fence line like he was tracking a ghost. I didn't mind. Quiet company suited me. Most days were just feed runs, checking the water tanks and trying to keep coyotes from getting bold. Nothing suggested that anything in my pasture held a secret worth remembering, much less retelling. At first, Ranger's odd habit barely registered. Every afternoon, as predictable as the sunset, he would tug old metal tools, chunks of plastic, even a cracked bucket or two across the pasture. He dragged everything to the far western corner, where the grass grew in a crooked swirl because the soil never seemed to decide if it wanted to be sandy or packed hard. I figured he was building himself some kind of nest, the way bored animals sometimes do. But there was something strange in the way he worked. Steady, determined, almost methodical. Whenever I called him back, he'd glance at me, then return to nudging whatever scrap he'd found toward that same patch of ground. I joked aloud once, telling him he looked like he was starting a junkyard, but his focus didn't shift for a second. After a couple of weeks, irritation started creeping in. I kept finding random farm tools missing from the shed, small things like a trowel or wire cutters, stuff I knew I hadn't misplaced. And every single item showed up in that same corner, half nestled into the dirt like Ranger wanted to bury the whole ranch there. One afternoon, after tripping over a cracked feed pan he had dragged out, I decided enough was enough. I clipped his leash on and tried pulling him away from the area to break the routine. He resisted in a way that surprised me, not aggressive, just solid, like a tree leaning into the wind. The moment I let the tension slacken, he went straight back, planted his paws, and stared at a particular spot on the ground, as if waiting for me to finally catch on. That stare worked on me more than anything else. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't excitement. It was more like he held a piece of knowledge he didn't know how to deliver. I crouched down where he kept pointing his attention, and noticed a shallow dip in the soil. Not deep, not obvious, but unnatural in a pasture that usually settled evenly. The grass there grew shorter, almost sunken, as if weight had pressed it down repeatedly. I pushed my fingers into the dirt just to feel the texture, and it crumbled looser than the surrounding ground. That was the first moment I felt a quiet pressure building in my chest, the kind that comes when part of your mind knows there's only one way this ends, and the other part begs you to walk away. I went back to the house for a shovel, telling myself I was just humoring a dog with quirks. But the whole walk back to that corner felt heavier than it should have. Ranger didn't wander or sniff around the way he usually did. He stayed close, moving with a strange patience, like he knew exactly what I was about to uncover. The soil gave way faster than I expected. A couple of scoops in, the loose top layer fell apart, exposing darker, colder earth beneath it. The smell shifted too. Not rotten, not fresh, just a dull, stale scent that didn't belong in open pasture. Ranger stepped back and sat down, rigid and alert. His gaze locked on the hole as if he were bracing for something I hadn't yet seen. The first unmistakable thing I uncovered was a scrap of fabric. Pale, dirty, and frayed. It clung to the soil like it had been swallowed whole over time. The sight of it knocked something loose in my memory. A local news segment from years before about a woman whose car had broken down on a rural highway not far from here. They said she vanished while waiting for help. Volunteers had searched ditches and fields up and down the road, but eventually the coverage faded, swallowed by newer stories. Still, that scrap of fabric felt like a message from a past everyone had quietly filed away. My throat tightened as I dug a little deeper, hands working slower now, careful, almost reluctant. Then I uncovered the unmistakable curve of a bone, human, thin, small. I didn't need to see any more to understand what Ranger had been trying to tell me all along. I set the shovel down and stepped back, my legs buzzing with an energy that made it hard to stand still. Ranger didn't move closer or farther. He just stayed there beside me, breathing slow, steady, almost grounding. I took out my phone with a clumsy urgency, dialing the sheriff's office and trying to explain what I'd found without letting my voice crack. They told me not to touch anything else, not to dig further, and to wait at the fence line until deputies arrived. The investigators showed up faster than I expected, likely because missing person cases, even old ones, still sit heavy on people's minds out here. They cordoned off the area, thanked me for stopping when I did, and brought in a forensic team before the sun dipped low. I sat on the tailgate of my truck with Ranger leaning against my leg, the both of us watching strangers move around a place that had always felt familiar until that afternoon. When the sheriff approached me, his face carried a mix of sympathy and exhaustion that told me what I already suspected. The remains likely belonged to the woman who had disappeared 3 years earlier. He mentioned something else too, a former farmhand who had worked for the previous owners. A man who left suddenly, never collected his last paycheck, and was seen near the stranded woman's car the day she vanished. What struck me later was how none of this ever came up when I bought the ranch. The previous owners mentioned that the old farmhand, a guy named Mason, had quit without warning, but they chalked it up to him being unreliable. They never hinted at anything darker, and maybe they truly didn't know. Investigators questioned me about anything he might have left behind, any odd stories, any places he favored on the property. I didn't have much to offer, just a memory of an empty bunkhouse with a cigarette burn on the windowsill and a broken radio lying on the floor, as if whoever lived there left in a rush. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the sheriff told me they were issuing new warrants and reaching out to nearby counties, almost certain they were dealing with a man who hadn't simply walked off a job. In the days that followed, the ranch felt different. Not haunted, just heavier, as if the land itself had been holding something in its lungs for years, and had finally exhaled. Ranger stayed close to me every morning, not pacing, not gathering scraps, just calm in a way I hadn't seen before. A detective stopped by to tell me they'd confirmed the remains belonged to the missing woman. They found personal items buried slightly deeper, fragments of a purse, a key fob, a bracelet with tiny teal stones. I didn't know her, but seeing those objects made everything ache in a way I hadn't expected. It turned the story from a headline into a person. When word got out, a few locals dropped by with casseroles and uneasy small talk, the way people do when tragedy brushes too close to their world. One older resident told me he remembered seeing the farmhand at a gas station the same week the woman disappeared, loading something into the back of an old pickup with mismatched doors. Nobody thought much of it at the time. People around here keep their eyes on their own problems unless something screams for attention. Hearing that made me look at the pasture differently. How close everything had been. How easily it could have stayed hidden forever if not for a dog who refused to give up. Eventually, the investigators packed up their equipment, the media attention drifted elsewhere, and the ranch settled back into its usual rhythm. But the corner of that pasture never felt like just another patch of land again. I installed a small wooden marker there. Not a memorial exactly, just something to acknowledge what the ground had held. Ranger visits it sometimes, sitting quietly as if keeping a final watch. They never found Mason, but the sheriff believes they will. People like him always leave a trail somewhere down the line. As for me, life goes on in the slow, steady way it always has out here. But I trust Ranger a little differently now. When he stops and stares at something, I pay attention. He saw the truth long before I ever did.